That seat is not for you. The words cut through the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin, just as the final passengers settled into their seats. Conversations faded. A few heads turned. The flight attendants froze for a brief moment before continuing their work with careful professionalism. At seat 1A beside the window sat a black woman wearing a simple navy travel blazer, reading a report on a tablet. She looked up calmly but did not appear surprised. Across the aisle stood Brennan Whitlock, the celebrated chief executive officer of Skybridge Airlines. At 59, Brennan had spent decades building a reputation as one of the most influential leaders in commercial aviation. Employees recognized him instantly. Investors trusted him. Business magazines regularly featured him on their covers. And in that moment he looked absolutely certain he was right. There must be some mistake, he continued, glancing toward a nearby flight attendant. Please verify her boarding pass. The flight attendant hesitated before offering a polite smile. Of course, sir. The woman by the window simply handed over her phone without protest. Her expression never changed. Outside, sunlight reflected across the aircraft wing, while airport vehicles moved slowly along the tarmac below. Inside the cabin, a strange tension began spreading from row to row. Several passengers exchanged curious glances. Others pretended not to notice while secretly listening to every word. The flight attendant checked the boarding information. Then she checked it again. A faint crease appeared on her forehead. Her boarding pass appears valid, she said carefully. Brennan frowned. Then verify it again. The woman in seat 1A remained completely relaxed. She crossed one leg over the other and looked back toward the window as if none of this concerned her. That reaction bothered Brennan more than anything else. Most people would have defended themselves. Most people would have looked embarrassed or frustrated. She did neither. Her calmness seemed almost intentional. Around them, the soft hum of the aircraft mixed with distant airport announcements drifting through the open cabin door. The flight attendants exchanged subtle looks. Something about the situation felt unusual. Brennan folded his arms. Ma'am, I am asking you politely to relocate while we sort this out. The woman finally met his eyes. I am comfortable where I am. Her voice was quiet, respectful, completely unshaken. A few nearby passengers looked up from their phones. The atmosphere inside first class had shifted. What should have been a routine boarding process now felt like the beginning of something nobody fully understood. If you enjoy stories about dignity, justice, and unexpected truths, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The aircraft preparing for departure that morning belonged to Skybridge Airlines, one of the fastest-growing carriers in the country. Brennan Whitlock had spent years becoming the public face of its success. What almost nobody on board knew was that the woman sitting quietly in seat 1A was named Zariah Langston. She rarely appeared in interviews, rarely attended public events, rarely attracted attention, and that was exactly how she preferred it. As the boarding door remained open and the departure clock continued ticking, Brennan became increasingly convinced that he was correcting a mistake. Zariah, meanwhile, seemed to know something that everyone else on that airplane had yet to discover. The flight attendant handed the phone back to Zariah Langston with visible uncertainty. The boarding pass remained valid. The seat assignment remained unchanged. Yet nobody seemed willing to end the conversation. Brennan Whitlock stood in the aisle beside seat 1A, his confidence untouched. Around him, first-class passengers pretended to focus on magazines, tablets, and phones, but their attention remained fixed on the unfolding situation. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage vehicles moved slowly beneath the bright morning sun. The departure countdown continued. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt increasingly strange. Zariah placed the phone back into her handbag and returned her attention to the report on her tablet. She made no attempt to explain herself, no attempt to prove anything. That silence became the most unusual part of the entire encounter. One of the younger flight attendants leaned toward her colleague and whispered something. The second attendant glanced toward Zariah before looking away again. Neither seemed comfortable with what was happening. Brennan noticed their hesitation. There is clearly an error somewhere, he said. I have flown on this airline for years. I know how these situations happen. The statement sounded reasonable. Several nearby passengers nodded slightly. Yet something about the woman in seat 1A continued creating doubt. She did not behave like someone caught in a mistake. She behaved like someone waiting for other people to catch up to the truth. The lead flight attendant finally spoke. "Sir, according to the system, everything appears correct." Brennan exhaled slowly. "Then call the gate desk and confirm it." The attendant hesitated only a moment before reaching for the cabin phone. Zariah remained completely composed. Sunlight reflected softly across the edge of her tablet screen as she reviewed a page of notes. The report contained handwritten observations, service ratings, maintenance summaries, and passenger experience data collected over several months. She had spent years reviewing information exactly like this. While most people associated airlines with aircraft and airports, she associated them with people. Employees, passengers, crews, decisions, culture. Those details mattered far more than advertising campaigns or executive speeches. Across the aisle, Brennan studied her carefully. The more he looked, the less sense the situation made. She appeared confident but not arrogant, professional but understated. There were no designer labels intended to impress anyone. No effort to attract attention. Nothing about her appearance matched the image he expected from someone sitting in one of the most expensive seats on the aircraft. His assumptions felt logical to him, yet the facts refused to cooperate. Several rows behind them, passengers quietly exchanged curious looks. One businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman traveling with her teenage daughter whispered a question. Even the cabin crew seemed increasingly interested in the outcome. The lead attendant listened carefully to the person on the phone, nodded several times, then slowly lowered the receiver. "The gate system confirms the booking." Brennan blinked. "Again?" "Yes, sir." The answer only deepened the confusion. For the first time, a small crease appeared across Brennan's forehead. The certainty he carried into the cabin remained, but cracks were beginning to form. Meanwhile, Zariah simply looked out the window toward the runway stretching across the distance. She had experienced situations like this before. People drawing conclusions before asking questions. People deciding where someone belonged before learning who they were. It no longer surprised her. What interested her was what people chose to do once the facts became impossible to ignore. The aircraft door remained open. Boarding had technically finished. Yet departure was now delayed by a question that nobody seemed able to answer. And while everyone else on the plane searched for an explanation, Zariah sat quietly in seat 1A, carrying a secret that would soon change the entire conversation. Brennan Whitlock remained standing in the aisle even after the gate desk confirmed the reservation a second time. The answer should have ended the matter. Instead, it seemed to deepen his conviction that something was wrong. The aircraft remained parked at the terminal while passengers settled into an uneasy silence. A few glanced toward their watches. Others looked through the cabin windows at the busy morning activity outside. The soft hum of the aircraft's environmental systems filled the air. Yet the center of attention remained seat 1A. Brennan slowly lowered himself into the seat across the aisle without taking his eyes off Zariah Langston. He was accustomed to being the person who recognized problems before anyone else. That confidence had helped him rise through the airline industry. It had earned him boardroom victories, investor trust, and national recognition. For years, people praised his instincts. Eventually, he began trusting them almost as much as facts. That habit rarely created problems. Until now. Zariah continued reviewing information on her tablet. She appeared entirely unconcerned by the growing attention surrounding her. The calmness fascinated some passengers and irritated others. One elderly traveler several rows back quietly whispered, "If she were in the wrong seat, she would have moved by now." His wife nodded without taking her eyes off the unfolding scene. Near the galley, a young flight attendant named Emily stood reviewing passenger information on a handheld device. Unlike most of the crew, she had only been with the airline for 2 years. She still paid attention to details older employees sometimes overlooked. Something about the situation felt incomplete. Brennan had clearly formed an opinion. Yet every system check supported the woman sitting by the window. Emily glanced toward Zariah again. The woman did not appear nervous. In fact, she seemed remarkably familiar with airline operations. The report visible on her screen contained maintenance performance statistics, customer satisfaction trends, route profitability summaries, and service audit notes. None of that made sense for an ordinary passenger. Emily frowned slightly. Across the aisle, Brennan noticed the same thing. Business consultant? He asked suddenly. Zariah looked up. Something like that. The answer was polite but offered no real information. Brennan waited for more. None came. The conversation ended as quickly as it began. Outside, a catering truck slowly pulled away from the aircraft. Ground crews completed final preparations for departure. Yet inside first class, time felt suspended. Brennan folded his arms. The longer this continued, the more determined he became to understand who she was. He believed people revealed themselves through status, titles, and visibility. Yet this woman offered none of those things. She seemed completely comfortable allowing others to underestimate her. That puzzled him. Most influential people wanted recognition. Most successful people wanted acknowledgement. Zariah appeared uninterested in either. Her attention returned to the tablet. One page contained handwritten notes from recent airport inspections. Another contained customer service observations collected from flights across the country. She reviewed them carefully, making small edits with the stylus. Every few minutes she added another note. Emily watched from a distance. A realization slowly began forming in her mind. Whoever this passenger was, she seemed less like a traveler and more like someone evaluating the airline itself. The thought sounded absurd, yet she could not dismiss it. Meanwhile, Brennan remained convinced the situation would eventually confirm his assumptions. What he did not realize was that the answer he wanted was already sitting directly across from him. The only thing preventing him from seeing it was the story he had already decided to believe. And within minutes, a single phone call would begin dismantling that story piece by piece. Emily could not shake the feeling that something important was being overlooked. While the rest of the cabin focused on the disagreement, she kept returning to the details. The reports on Zariah Langston's tablet, the confidence in her posture, the complete absence of anxiety. None of it fit the situation. Most passengers caught in a dispute with an airline executive would become defensive. Some would become angry. Others would begin explaining themselves. Zariah did none of those things. She simply continued observing, watching, taking notes, as if the delay itself had become part of whatever she was evaluating. The aircraft door remained open. A departure delay notification had already been entered into the system. Outside the window, airport personnel moved briskly beneath the bright morning sky. The runway shimmered in the distance beneath the sun. Inside the cabin, the tension had settled into a quieter form. People were no longer waiting for an argument. They were waiting for an answer. Brennan Whitlock checked his watch and frowned. Every additional minute irritated him. He believed efficiency was one of the foundations of a successful airline. Delays created costs. Costs created problems. Yet despite his frustration, he remained convinced he was addressing an issue that needed attention. He looked toward Zariah again. "You seem unusually calm." She glanced up from her tablet. "Should I be upset?" The question caught him off guard. Before he could respond, she returned to her notes. Several nearby passengers exchanged curious looks. Brennan felt a growing sense of discomfort he could not explain. He was accustomed to controlling conversations. This one seemed to move according to rules he did not understand. Near the front galley, Emily received a message through her crew device. She reviewed it briefly, then frowned. The information did not solve anything. If anything, it made the situation stranger. Every record associated with Seat 1A appeared flawless. No booking errors. No upgrades processed incorrectly. No duplicate reservations. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The passenger belonged exactly where she was sitting. Emily slowly approached the lead flight attendant. After a quiet conversation, both women glanced toward Zariah. Then they looked at one another again. The lead attendant finally nodded. Emily walked toward Seat 1A. "Ma'am," she said politely, "may I ask a question?" Zariah smiled. "Of course." Emily hesitated. "Have you flown with us before?" A faint warmth appeared in Zariah's expression. "A few times." Several passengers listening nearby almost smiled at the understatement. Emily nodded. "That is what I thought." Brennan immediately noticed the exchange. "What exactly does that mean?" Emily chose her words carefully. It means she seems very familiar with our operations. Brennan dismissed the observation with a wave of his hand. Plenty of frequent travelers know airline operations. Yet even as he said it, he remembered the reports he had seen on her tablet. Maintenance statistics, service audits, internal performance measurements. The memory lingered in his mind. For the first time, uncertainty began competing with confidence. Zariah closed the tablet and looked out the window. The sunlight reflected across the aircraft wing in bright flashes of silver. She had spent years visiting airports without announcing who she was. Years listening to employees who spoke more honestly when they thought nobody important was watching. Years discovering problems hidden beneath polished presentations and executive summaries. Those visits had taught her something valuable. The truth usually revealed itself when people believed nobody powerful was paying attention. Suddenly, a phone began ringing. The sound cut through the quiet cabin. Brennan reached into his jacket and looked at the screen. The moment he saw the caller identification, his expression changed. It was a direct call from the chairman of the board. The same chairman who almost never contacted him during active travel. Conversations around the cabin stopped. Even the flight attendants seemed to notice the shift. Brennan answered immediately. "Good morning." What he heard next caused every trace of confidence to disappear from his face. And for the first time since boarding the aircraft, Zariah slowly turned away from the window and looked directly at him. Brennan Whitlock listened in silence as the chairman of the board spoke. The color slowly drained from his face. The confident posture he had carried since boarding the aircraft seemed to vanish with every passing second. Around him, passengers noticed the change immediately. The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances. Even Emily, standing near the galley, could tell that something significant had just happened. Brennan no longer looked like a man defending a decision. He looked like a man realizing he had misunderstood the situation entirely. "I understand," he said quietly into the phone. Then he listened again. Several long seconds passed. "Yes, sir." Another pause followed. "No, nobody informed me." The answer came almost as a whisper. Across the aisle, Zariah Langston remained calm. Her tablet rested closed on the tray table. Sunlight reflected softly across the window beside her. Unlike everyone else in the cabin, she did not seem curious about the conversation. It was almost as if she already knew what was being said. Brennan slowly lowered the phone. The cabin felt impossibly quiet. One by one, nearby passengers looked away, pretending not to stare. Yet everyone was waiting. Brennan remained frozen for a moment before looking directly at Zariah. The certainty that had defined him earlier was gone. In its place stood confusion, disbelief, and something else. Recognition. Not recognition of her face. Recognition of a mistake. "Ms. Langston," he said carefully. The use of her name immediately caught the attention of the crew. Until that moment, nobody had heard him address her that way. Zariah looked up. "Yes." Brennan opened his mouth then stopped. For perhaps the first time in years, words failed him. He glanced toward the flight attendants, then toward the passengers. Finally, he looked back at her. "I was not aware." Zariah studied him quietly. Aware of what? The question was gentle, not hostile, not mocking. Yet it forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. Brennan took a slow breath. The chairman's words echoed in his mind. Not because they were angry, because they were simple. The woman sitting in seat 1A was not merely an important customer. She was not a consultant. She was not a VIP traveler. She was the majority shareholder whose investments had transformed Skybridge Airlines years earlier. The person responsible for saving the company during one of the most difficult periods in its history. The person whose vision had guided the airline's expansion across the country. The person who technically owned the largest controlling interest in the organization he managed every day. Emily's eyes widened as realization spread through the cabin crew. One attendant quietly covered her mouth in surprise. Another stared toward Zariah with disbelief. Brennan felt every eye in first class shifting toward him. Yet nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The silence carried enough weight on its own. Outside, airport vehicles continued moving across the tarmac. Ground crews completed routine tasks. The world beyond the aircraft remained ordinary. Inside the cabin, however, everything had changed. Brennan looked at Soraya again. The reports, the inspections, the service reviews, the confidence. Suddenly every detail made sense. She had not been reviewing airline data because she was a frequent traveler. She had been reviewing it because the airline belonged to her. More importantly, she had never mentioned it. She had never demanded special treatment, never revealed her position, never used her influence. She had simply allowed people to reveal themselves. The realization settled heavily over the cabin. For all his experience, all his authority, and all his assumptions, Brennan had failed to ask the one question that mattered most. Who was the person sitting directly in front of him? And now that he finally knew the answer, he understood that the real issue had never been Seat 1A at all. It had been the judgment he formed long before he bothered to learn the truth. For several moments nobody moved. The entire first-class cabin seemed suspended in silence. The only sounds came from the distant hum of the aircraft systems and the occasional movement of luggage being loaded below the cabin floor. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting bright reflections across the polished surfaces of the cabin. Yet no one appeared interested in the view anymore. Every thought remained focused on the woman in Seat 1A, and the revelation that had just changed everything. Brennan Whitlock slowly lowered himself into the seat across the aisle. The energy that had driven his confidence earlier had disappeared. He stared toward the floor for a moment before looking back at Soraya Langston. She remained exactly as she had been from the beginning. Calm, composed, unshaken. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around them, passengers quietly returned to their seats, but nobody resumed their previous conversations. Even the flight attendants moved more carefully now. Emily walked toward the galley, her mind replaying the past 30 minutes. Every assumption she had watched unfold now looked different. The reports on the tablet, the observations, the questions. Suddenly they made perfect sense. Near the front of the cabin, the lead attendant received clearance to begin departure procedures again. Yet before she could make the announcement, Brennan stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, slowly, deliberately. The movement drew attention throughout the cabin. He stepped into the aisle and looked directly at Soraya. His voice, when he finally spoke, sounded very different from before. I owe you an apology. Nobody interrupted. The words seemed to settle over the cabin like a quiet wave. Brennan continued. I made assumptions before asking questions. I believed I understood the situation without understanding the person. The honesty surprised several passengers. Corporate leaders rarely admitted mistakes publicly. Yet there was no defensiveness left in his voice. Only sincerity. Soraya looked at him for a moment. Then she offered a small smile. That happens more often than people realize. The answer was neither harsh nor forgiving. It was simply true. Brennan nodded slowly. He glanced toward the flight attendants, then toward the passengers who had witnessed the entire situation. What concerns me most is not that I was wrong. He paused briefly. It is how quickly I decided I was right. The statement lingered in the quiet cabin. Emily felt a chill run through her. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were honest. Outside the window, a service vehicle crossed the tarmac beneath the morning sun. The world continued moving. Yet inside the aircraft, something meaningful was happening. Soraya closed the folder resting beside her and looked toward Brennan. The health of an airline is not measured by aircraft alone. Several crew members listened carefully. It is measured by how people are treated when nobody thinks they are important. No one spoke after that. The truth of the statement required no explanation. Brennan slowly lowered his eyes. He understood exactly what she meant. Throughout his career, he had focused on metrics, growth, market share, and operational performance. Those things mattered. But culture mattered too. Respect mattered. The assumptions people carried mattered. For the first time that morning, he began seeing the situation through a different lens. This had never been about a seat assignment. It had been a test. Not of Soraya, of everyone else. The lead flight attendant finally made the departure announcement. Seatbelts clicked into place throughout the cabin. Passengers adjusted their belongings and prepared for takeoff. Yet the atmosphere felt different now. Softer. More thoughtful. As the aircraft door closed and sunlight reflected across the wing outside, Brennan returned to his seat in silence. Across the aisle, Zariah looked out the window toward the runway stretching into the distance. Neither spoke again. But both understood that the most important part of the journey had already begun long before the airplane ever left the ground. The aircraft accelerated down the runway as sunlight flashed across the cabin windows. Moments later, the wheels lifted from the ground and the city below began shrinking into a patchwork of streets, buildings, and rivers. A gentle hum settled over the cabin as the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude. Most passengers returned to their routines. Laptops opened. Headphones appeared. Coffee cups rested on tray tables. Yet beneath the appearance of normalcy, something had changed. The atmosphere felt quieter, more reflective. Brennan Whitlock sat beside the window across the aisle, watching clouds gather beneath the aircraft. He had spent decades flying across the country, yet he could not remember another flight that had forced him to examine himself so honestly. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward seat 1A. Zariah Langston had reopened her tablet and resumed reviewing reports. There was no sign that she considered herself the center of attention. If anything, she appeared relieved that the conversation had ended. That realization stayed with Brennan. Most people in her position would have enjoyed the moment. They would have wanted recognition, validation, perhaps even revenge. Zariah wanted none of those things. About an hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign switched off. Flight attendants began moving through the cabin offering refreshments. Emily approached seat 1A carrying a tray. Her nervousness from earlier had disappeared, replaced by curiosity and respect. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" Zariah smiled warmly. "Coffee, please." Emily poured the coffee carefully and handed it to her. Before stepping away, she hesitated. "May I ask you something?" Zariah nodded. "Of course." Emily lowered her voice. "Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" The question reflected what many people in the cabin had been wondering. Zariah looked out the window toward the bright horizon. For a moment she seemed to search for the right words. Then she answered, "Because titles change how people behave." Emily listened carefully. "When people do not know who you are, they show you who they are." The answer lingered in the air long after Emily returned to her duties. Across the aisle, Brennan heard every word. He stared at the clouds outside his window and felt a quiet sense of discomfort. Not because she was criticizing him, because she was right. Throughout his career, people often behaved differently around him because of his title. Executives agreed with him more quickly. Employees became cautious. Strangers became accommodating. He had grown so accustomed to that reality that he rarely questioned it. Now he wondered how much truth he might have missed because people were reacting to his position rather than his character. Several rows behind them, passengers had gradually learned who Zariah was through whispers and quiet conversations. Yet what impressed them most was not her ownership stake in the airline. It was her behavior. She had remained calm when challenged, respectful when questioned, gracious when proven right. The contrast left a lasting impression. As the aircraft cruised 35,000 feet above the clouds, the sunlight outside became brighter, transforming the sky into a vast ocean of white and gold. Brennan glanced toward Zariah once more. This time he did not see a passenger. He did not see an executive. He saw a leader. Someone secure enough to let actions speak louder than status. Someone who understood that respect gained through fear or authority was fragile, but respect earned through character lasted much longer. And somewhere above the clouds, surrounded by quiet conversations and endless sky, Brennan realized that the most valuable lesson of the day had nothing to do with airlines at all. It was about the difference between seeing a person and seeing an assumption. Until that morning, he had confused the two without ever noticing. Now he knew better. Several hours later, the aircraft began its gradual descent through a blanket of white clouds. The cabin lights softened as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows at a lower angle. Below them, a coastline emerged beside clusters of buildings and winding highways. The journey was nearing its end, but for many people on board, the most memorable part of the trip had little to do with the destination. Throughout the flight, quiet conversations had spread through the cabin. Crew members reflected on what had happened. Passengers exchanged observations. Yet the person responsible for the lesson remained remarkably unchanged. Zariah Langston continued reviewing reports, making notes, and occasionally looking out at the horizon. She never sought attention. She never corrected anyone who praised her. She simply continued working. Brennan Whitlock noticed that detail more than anything else. As the aircraft descended, he found himself thinking about the company's future. For years, leadership meetings had focused on numbers, growth targets, fleet expansion, and shareholder expectations. Those goals remained important, yet suddenly they seemed incomplete. What good were impressive metrics if people felt unseen? What good was success if assumptions shaped decisions more than understanding? The question stayed with him as the seatbelt sign illuminated once again. Flight attendants moved through the cabin preparing for arrival. Emily paused briefly beside Brennan's seat. "Everything ready for landing, sir?" Brennan nodded. Then, after a moment, he asked a question that surprised even him. "How long have you worked for the airline?" Emily smiled. "Almost 2 years." Brennan looked thoughtful. "Have you ever felt uncomfortable speaking up about something?" Emily hesitated. The honesty of the question caught her off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted. Brennan nodded slowly. "Thank you for answering honestly." The conversation lasted only seconds, but Emily sensed something important behind it. This was not the same executive who had boarded the aircraft earlier that morning. Across the aisle, Zariah observed the exchange without saying anything. The aircraft continued descending through scattered clouds. Sunlight reflected across the wing outside, creating flashes of gold against the deep blue sky. The beauty of the scene seemed to quiet the entire cabin. When the wheels finally touched the runway, a gentle vibration moved through the aircraft. Passengers looked up from their devices. Some gathered belongings. Others simply stared through the windows as the plane rolled toward the terminal. Brennan remained seated. The moment felt symbolic somehow. A journey ending. Another beginning. As the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers began standing. Overhead bins opened. Conversations resumed. Yet before anyone left, Brennan rose from his seat and stepped into the aisle. Several passengers paused when they noticed him walking toward seat 1A. He stopped beside Zariah. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Brennan offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you." Zariah looked up. "For what?" Brennan glanced around the cabin. "For reminding me that leadership is not about being the most important person in the room." He paused. "It is about making sure every person in the room matters." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything he had learned that day. Zariah returned the smile. "That is a lesson worth keeping." Around them, passengers quietly continued leaving the aircraft. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just a calm understanding shared among people who had witnessed something meaningful. Outside the windows, the afternoon sunlight stretched across the airport ramp. Ground crews moved efficiently between aircraft. Travelers hurried toward their next destinations. Life continued. Yet as Zariah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, Brennan understood that some journeys changed more than location. They changed perspective. And sometimes that was the destination that mattered most. 3 months later, sunlight poured through the glass walls of Skybridge Airlines headquarters as employees moved through another busy workday. Travelers filled airports across the country. Aircraft crossed thousands of miles of sky. Departure boards updated every minute. On the surface, everything looked the same. Yet inside the company, subtle changes had begun spreading from one department to another. Managers spent more time listening before making decisions. Frontline employees were encouraged to share concerns without fear of being dismissed. Customer experience reviews received greater attention than ever before. None of the changes appeared dramatic from the outside. But together, they were reshaping the culture of the airline. On the top floor executive office, Brennan Whitlock stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The afternoon sun reflected across nearby buildings while aircraft traced white lines through the distant blue sky. A leadership meeting had ended only minutes earlier. For the first time in years, junior employees had been invited to challenge executive assumptions during the discussion. Some of their observations had revealed issues senior leaders had completely overlooked. Instead of feeling threatened, Brennan found himself grateful. He understood now that good leadership was not about having every answer. It was about creating an environment where truth could be heard. On his desk sat a small notebook. Inside were several lessons he had written after that flight. One sentence remained underlined. Respect should never depend on recognition. He had thought about those words often. Not because they sounded impressive, because they were true. Across the country, Zariah Langston continued traveling quietly between airports, maintenance facilities, and regional offices. Most employees still did not recognize her. She preferred it that way. During visits, she listened more than she spoke. She watched how passengers were treated. She observed how employees interacted with one another. She paid attention to small details most reports never captured. Those details told the real story of an organization. Late one afternoon, Brennan received a message from the chairman of the board. The quarterly employee satisfaction survey had just been completed. The results were the strongest in company history. Customer satisfaction scores had improved as well. Internal communication ratings had increased significantly. Brennan smiled as he read the report. Numbers mattered. But these numbers represented people. That made them different. A few weeks later, he attended a company event at a large maintenance facility outside Dallas. Hundreds of employees gathered inside one of the hangars. Technicians, pilots, customer service representatives, baggage teams, and flight attendants filled the room. During the event, Brennan spoke briefly about growth and performance. Then he paused and shared a different lesson. He told them that assumptions could be expensive, that every person deserved dignity before explanation, that listening was often more valuable than speaking. The room grew quiet. Many employees did not know the story behind those words. They did not need to. The lesson stood on its own. As evening settled across the facility, aircraft rested beneath golden sunlight outside the hangar doors. Employees slowly returned to work. Conversations faded. Engines hummed in the distance. Life moved forward. Thousands of miles away, Zariah sat beside another airplane window preparing for another flight. The sky beyond the glass glowed orange and gold as the sun slipped toward the horizon. She looked out at the runway and allowed herself a small smile. Not because she had proven anyone wrong. Not because she owned an airline. But because somewhere along the way a lesson had been learned. The aircraft began pushing back from the gate. Lights flickered across the wing. Beyond the runway, the horizon stretched endlessly beneath the evening sky. Zariah watched quietly as the world moved past the window. There was no need for another conversation. No need for another explanation. Sometimes the most meaningful victories arrived without applause. They arrived when people chose understanding over assumption. And as the airplane rolled toward the runway beneath the fading light, the silence felt complete, carrying with it the quiet certainty that dignity never needed permission to belong.